Good morning. So on Tuesday, I was outlining a pair of lectures about responses to the Great War and what types of legacies that war had and what types of changes it caused or catalyzed. And the lecture on Tuesday basically outlined the cultural and political responses to the war and tried to detail what historians have described as an introspective turn to domestic life in the deep countryside in order to rebuild a sense of tranquility and stability in the country. That raised the big issue, really, for many people of what the war had been fought for. Whether the war had been fought to return to a so-called Edwardian Golden Age, or whether it had been fought to try and build a new type of society, to imagine some type of different prospective future. So what I'm going to do today is turn away from those sort of cultural and political responses to the war and look more at the economic consequences of the war and at the responses to those. And the key issue that we're going to explore in today's lecture is the degree to which the 1920s and the 1930s represented a definitive moment of turning away from the liberal political economy of the 19th century that, as you know now because I repeat this in almost every lecture, was structured around the ideas of free trade, of cheap government, and the gold standard. And the issue we have to figure out today is what came to replace that, and how far Britain did indeed turn away from it, and what came to stand in its place. And basically what I'm going to be suggesting to you today is in the 1920s and 1930s you see the emergence of a new interest, indeed one might even say a new vogue, for the idea of planning. And having an economy and a society based not around the freedom of the market, but of planned government intervention in both of those areas. So let me begin by talking about the economic chaos that followed the war. And I'm going to do this basically under three headings, which I'm just outlining to you here. First of all, I'm going to talk about the cost of war and its consequences on the attempt to try and re-establish liberal political economy. Then I'm going to talk about the domestic restructuring of the economy in the 1920s and 1930s, and then I'm going to outline the scale of unemployment and what I'm going to talk about as the rediscovery of poverty. So let's start with the cost of war. I told you on Tuesday that the war was hugely expensive financially for Britain, and that the national debt, which had been in decline since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, as you can see in this graph, took a decisive leap and rose from 706 million in 1914 to 7.4 million pounds. No, that's wrong. 7.4 billion pounds. And that continued, indeed, to grow during the 1920s and 1930s, and indeed, as you can see from this graph, reaches, well, you can't because the dates aren't clear enough, but it reaches a peak in 1934. Now, Victorian liberal political economy had been based around the idea of sound finance and cheap government, of reducing the scale of national debt. And one of the first things that British governments do, and this is again a cross-party trend, one of the first things that the British government does is to try and reduce public expenditure. It's not so much of an issue in the immediate aftermath of the war, okay, with the standing down of the war economy that I outlined to you last night. But it becomes a particular issue with the beginning of an economic downturn in 1921, 1922. And it's then that there are real attempts to introduce new austerity measures, to retrench government expenditure. And that took the form of the so-called Geddes Act on public expenditure. So the first thing that the British government does is to try and reduce the scale of national debt by reducing levels of the public expenditure. Free trade, of course, completely disrupted by the First World War, is again immediately re-established in the aftermath of the war. Okay? It's very clear that the Treasury in the British government is determined to re-establish the British economy on its late Victorian and Edwardian footings in the aftermath of the war. And a key part of that was, as I said to you on Tuesday, the determination to return to the gold standard that had made the City of London the financial capital of the world and had facilitated Britain's facilitated Britain's overseas trade and the practice of free trade within a broadly protectionist international economy. However, these attempts to reinstall these three central pillars of cheap government, free trade, and the gold standard hit a series of crises. First of all, the reintroduction of the re-establishment of the gold standard creates a massive collapse in British export markets. Remember, they re-established the gold standard at its pre-war levels, and this makes British goods incredibly uncompetitive abroad. Suddenly, they become 20 to 30% more expensive. This, of course, leads to pressure on wages by employers trying to keep their profit margins high. Okay? It's that downward pressure on wages that leads to a number of industrial actions by the trade union movement in the first half of the 1920s and culminates with the general strike of 1926, when pretty much 2 million unionised workers go out on strike. But the travails of the British economy weren't just British. They were also global in form, and that was very evident with the global financial crash of 1929. A crash that, of course, began in the New York stock market, but came to have a calamitous effect on the world economy. The combination of these trends leads to the British government facing an enormous financial crisis in 1931. It's at that point that, so dramatic is this crisis, that a national government is formed which brings together the Labour Party, which had unluckily had its first majority government in 1929, just at the moment of this dramatic financial crisis, and primarily the Conservative Party. And as we'll see, one of the things that the national government sets out to do is to accelerate austerity measures. Now, the point that you need to get here is even though the so-called Great Depression from 1929 is a global economic depression, it takes a very specific form in Britain, and it takes a very specific form because Britain is facing unique challenges. It's facing the unique challenge of its financial debt from the war. It's facing the unique challenge of having lost the comparative advantage of its early industrialization. And it was in a unique position because it still had the very considerable economic resource of the world's largest empire. Nonetheless, it's in 1931 that we can say that Britain basically leaves behind the central tenets of that liberal political economy. There may still be an insistence upon cheap government and getting government expenditure under control, but it's in 1931 that Britain finally abandons free trade and abandons the gold standard. So in 1931, a general tariff is introduced on manufactured goods, on the import of manufactured goods, with the exception of food, because remember Britain was dependent upon the imports of overseas food, certain key strategic raw materials, and most importantly of all, on all goods from the empire. In other words, what we see in 1931 looks not that dissimilar to the Chamberlainite policies of an imperial tariff system, of trying to make the British economy march in lockstep with an imperial, with the empire. So how then does the British economy restructure itself given these crises and these new challenges it faces? Well, the first part of this story is actually a holdover from the war. One of the ways in which British capitalists had got by during the First World War was by disinvesting from its foreign assets. Investment abroad contracted by about 20% during the course of the First World War, and that basically that trend is reversed. But Britain never recaptures the same levels of overseas investment that had been so important to its late Victorian economy. The return to the gold standard, as you now know, led to a very dramatic collapse of its export markets, not just the retreat from the gold standard, but also, of course, the scale of global depression. So you have here a graph of UK cotton exports, where you can see how dramatically in the 20s and 30s that drop-off is. The average value of exports falls on an index from 1920 to 1932 from 245 to 86, dramatically more than halved, although it recovers again by 1938, or it rises to the level of 100. There's also a collapse in the value of Britain's staple industries between 1920 and 1938, and I've just given you here the figures for coal and iron and steel. And the key point that you need to get here is that the nadir of the British economy, mapped here in terms of the value of staple industries, was basically in 1932, 1933. This is the low watermark of the British economy. Of course, the decline in this export economy means a dramatic drop of employment in these sectors. So, for instance, in 1924, the coal industry employs 1.25 million men. By 1938, there's just 782,000 coal miners left in Britain. So how does the British economy adapt to this significant decline of its export capacity? One way was by the development of new domestically orientated industries. And here there's a very nice synergy between the turn to new forms of domesticity in social and cultural life and the reorientation of the economy around domestic consumer durables. Again, very interestingly, many of these consumer durables produced in basically what we can think of as light engineering industry, which was electrically powered on the new national grid that was taking shape in the middle of the 1920s, enabled employers to hire women in unprecedented numbers to assemble these goods. Okay? So one of the things that happens in the 1920s and the 1930s is a very slow but significant shift away from the old male industrial worker that we associate with the staple industries and the rise of a new woman worker in light engineering. And women, of course, are still playing an important part in the industries they already had, like the textile industry. But women aren't just producing these goods. These goods are often also marketed for women. We're talking about things like irons, vacuum cleaners, toasters, tampons, cigarettes, a whole range of canned foods, all of these things. It's estimated that the size of women in these new industries rose to about 750,000 workers in the middle of the 1930s. And most of them were young, single women. Of women in the workforce in 1931, 70% of them were single. 77% of them were single, and 72% of them were aged between 15 and 34, which in my book still qualifies as young. It might not in yours, but 34 to me looks decisively youthful. The other point that I want to make about these is that these new industries are all located primarily in the south, in London, in the sort of main arterial corridors in and out of London, West London. That if any of you have arrived in Heathrow, that journey that you take from Heathrow into central London is an absolutely key corridor for the development of these industries. Many of those old factories are along that road, and very, very few in the old industrial north. Now, I've been talking about the collapse of the export market, the development of this new domestically orientated economy around consumer goods, but there's also a continuing and indeed deepening importance of the empire to the British economy. Indeed, in many ways, the economy is structured around the empire in new and important ways in the 1930s. Given the system of imperial tariffs, exports to the empire rise, not surprisingly, in this, I haven't got any dates up there, these dates are, I think, from 1924 to 1938. And one of the ways that this is consolidated is also in the government's very deliberate attempt to market imperial goods, both marketing British goods across the empire and marketing imperial goods in Britain. A great example of that was the creation in 1926 of the Empire Marketing Board, which produced a series of films and advertising that circulated widely in Britain and the empire, trying to educate British people about imperial goods. But also, this is important, the first Colonial Development Act in 1929. No surprise that the first Colonial Development Act happens in the aftermath of the crash of 1929. It's deliberately intended to try and develop colonial economies, not for their own good, but so that they can help the ailing British economy. The other key intertwining of the British economy with its imperial economy was the creation of the sterling area in 1931. When Britain left the gold standard, it tried to bolster the value of the pound by creating a financial currency system around the sterling, in which all members of the empire participated in, and indeed many other countries outside the empire, like Argentina, chose to be part of that sterling area because of the volume of trade they did with Britain. And I haven't got time to go into the rest. The point that I want to try and make here is simply that the British economy becomes profoundly dependent upon the empire in new structural ways in the late 20s and early 1930s. Now, it's very important to say that this turn to the development of new domestic industries, the growing dependence upon an imperial economy, did not rescue the British economy. The British economy was profoundly depressed through much of the 1920s and the 1930s. And the very best measure of that was, of course, the scale of unemployment. Now, it's not that unemployment had never existed before, but it is the case that unemployment figures hadn't existed before 1911. Until you have a system of national insurance and unemployment benefits, which was created in 1911, you have no official statistics for unemployment rates. So what we have is sort of guesstimates of the scale of unemployment before 1911. Demobilisation after the war, basically the demobilisation of 750,000 men from the British Army, the standing down of that war economy, both of these things had a dramatic effect on the rising ranks of the unemployed, which reached 2 million people by 1921. Throughout the interwar period, unemployment basically hovers between 10 and 25% of the workforce. That's between 1.5 million and 2.5 million. And it indeed peaks in 1932 at 3 million. And those figures are really, in some ways, just the tip of the iceberg, because unemployment figures excluded, the government's unemployment figures excluded those workers that were not under the national insurance scheme. Okay? So that was particularly the case, for instance, for women, who didn't show up on unemployment rates. Unemployment was also very unevenly distributed in terms of its geography. It was clustered primarily not in the new booming southern economy, but in the old industrial areas. Okay, so, and this is what the map that I was trying to find before the beginning of the class, because I wanted to be able to show you this on a map. So think basically of South Wales, the industrial Midlands, the industrial Northwest, which stretches from Sheffield to Liverpool across to Leeds, and the industrial Northeast, places like Newcastle, Gateshead, Sunderland, and the Clyde Valley in Scotland. Okay? These areas, and Belfast, I should add, so in Northern Ireland. These areas become officially designated distressed areas in 1934. One of the things that the national government tries to do is to insist that unemployment is not a universal or general phenomenon. And so it tries to say, look, it happens primarily, it's not a general problem with the economy, it's just a problem in these very specific places, in these so-called distressed areas. And these distressed areas were given new grant schemes and such to try and facilitate the growth of employment. Now, this is where it begins to get a little complicated. Okay? Historians have argued for generations about whether things are good or bad in the 1920s and the 1930s, because we have this complex picture of, on the one hand, unprecedented levels of unemployment, and yet, on the other hand, we have a falling cost of living and areas of the economy that seem to be booming. The property market, the new industries, all of these salaried workers, government salaried workers, and so forth. So we have a disjunction between, on the one hand, the stagnation or decline of wages for the majority of the population, and a rising standard of living for the salaried middle classes, those people that were buying Leos in sevens and taking out their mortgages and